3 elderly nuns gathered to wash the body of Sister Beatrice, a woman who had lived in holy silence for 20 years. But as the heavy wool fell away, their prayers turned to screams of terror. This wasn't a bride of Christ, it was a man. And he wasn't the only one. How many sisters were hiding a beard beneath their veils? Within the damp, sunless crypt of a remote abbey in the 14th century, the air is thick with the heavy scent of beeswax and cold, ancient stone. 3 elderly nuns, their hands trembling with age and grief, gather around the cooling body of Sister Beatrice. She had been a pillar of their community, a woman who spent 20 years in almost total silence, her face always partially obscured by the deep shadows of her black veil. They prepare to perform the final washings, a sacred ritual that marks the transition from this world to the next, unaware that the silence they respected was a carefully constructed shield for a truth that would soon shatter their reality. As the heavy, coarse wool of the monastic habit is slowly unfastened and pulled away from the emaciated frame, the flickering candlelight reveals a sight that stops the breath of the witnesses. The smooth skin they expected to find is replaced by the unmistakable anatomy of a man. The ice of pure, unadulterated terror grips the hearts of the old women as they stare at the physical evidence of a decades-long deception. The person they called sister, the one who knelt beside them in the choir and shared their meager bread, had lived a lie so profound that it challenged the very foundations of their sacred vows and their understanding of the divine order. The silence in the crypt becomes suffocating as the realization sinks in that every prayer shared and every confession whispered occurred in the presence of an impostor. This secret, hidden for 20 years, now threatens to rise from the grave and consume the reputation of the entire order. The old women exchange looks of profound confusion and betrayal, their faith shaken by the proximity of the masculine to their most intimate feminine sanctum. They realize that the men who lived as Beatrice was not just a guest, but a ghost who had haunted their prayers and rituals, turning their holy refuge into a stage for a silent, lifelong performance of gender. Beatrice had been known for her extreme modesty, never allowing another soul to see her unclothed and always seeking the darkest corners of the chapel for her private devotions. Now, the logic of that modesty is revealed as a desperate strategy for survival rather than a mark of saintliness. The layers of linen and wool that she wore were not merely garments of penance, but a fortress designed to repel the gaze of the world and protect a secret that would have meant certain death if discovered. The very attributes that made her seem more holy than the rest were the tools of a master of disguise who had mastered the art of being invisible. The funeral preparations continue in a state of grim, mechanical necessity, for the scandal of such a discovery would be too great for the church to endure if it ever reached the ears of the village. They decide to bury the body as it is, sealing the truth beneath the heavy stone floor of the chapel, but the psychological wound remains open and bleeding. In the flickering light, the corpse of the man looks like a mocking monument to the fallibility of human perception. This single event, tucked away in a corner of history, serves as a terrifying introduction to a much larger and more systemic crisis that was quietly brewing across the entire continent. In the 14th century, the convent was often the only refuge for the daughters of the nobility, a place of safety and education in a world of violence. However, these walls also became a target for those who sought to breach the ultimate boundary of medieval society. The isolation that was meant to preserve the purity of the sisters instead created a vacuum that drew in the curious, the desperate, and the predatory. Across Europe, from the sun-drenched valleys of Italy to the mist-covered hills of England, rumors began to circulate about monasteries where the chants of the sisters sounded unusually deep and the shadows in the corridors were too tall. The motivation for such a dangerous infiltration was often rooted in a twisted form of devotion or a simple, carnal desire for the forbidden. For a man to shave his face, soften his gait, and adopt the restrictive life of a nun required a level of commitment that bordered on the fanatical. Some were driven by a forbidden love for a woman already committed to the veil, while others were opportunists seeking a place where they could live without the burdens of taxes or military service. Whatever the reason, the result was a slow infiltration of the sacred feminine space by the very elements it was designed to exclude, creating a hidden world within a world. The physical transformation required constant vigilance, as the natural growth of a beard could betray the impostor at any moment. These men became experts in the use of pumice stones and herbal concoctions to keep their skin smooth, often claiming to suffer from mysterious skin ailments to explain their frequent seclusion and use of powders. Every morning before the bells rang for the first prayer of the day, they would undergo a secret ritual of grooming, meticulously removing any trace of masculinity that might have surfaced during the night. Their lives became a perpetual battle against their own biology, fought in the dim light of a flickering candle. Beyond the physical, there was the challenge of the voice and the mannerisms that defined the medieval woman of God. These men learned to speak in hushed, melodic tones, carefully controlling the pitch of their voices to avoid the deep resonance that would surely alert the sisters. They mimicked the graceful, gliding walk of the nuns, hiding the stride of a man beneath the voluminous folds of their skirts. Every gesture, from the way they held a prayer book to the tilt of their head during a sermon, was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of survival where the prize was access to the most private lives of women. History records that during the year 1388, a series of visitations by the Bishop of Lincoln revealed a disturbing pattern of irregularities in several prominent convents. The report spoke of sisters who possessed unusual physical strength and whose features were remarkably coarse, despite their claims of noble birth. These visitations often resulted in sudden disappearances, as those who feared discovery vanished into the night before the final inspections could be completed. The church began to realize that the walls of the cloister were not as impenetrable as they had hoped, and that the sanctity of the veil was being compromised. The comedy of these situations often masked a deeper, more sinister reality of exploitation and moral decay within the church hierarchy. While some stories of bearded nuns were whispered as jokes in the taverns, for the women who lived in these abbeys, the presence of an impostor was a violation of the highest order. It turned their home into a place of suspicion and fear, where every new novice was scrutinized and every shared secret felt like a potential trap. The spiritual safety of the convent was replaced by a creeping dread that the person praying in the next stall might be a predator in disguise, watching and waiting. As the sun begins to rise over the abbey, the three old nuns finish their grim task and seal the grave of Sister Beatrice, or whoever he truly was. They will never speak of this night again, carrying the weight of the secret to their own graves, but the shadow of the men in the habit will linger in the halls of the convent. The story of Beatrice is not an isolated incident but a symptom of an era where the lines between the sacred and the profane were blurred by the mask of the masquerade. The holy walls have been breached, and the echo of masculine footsteps in the feminine sanctuary will continue to resonate through the centuries. The medieval landscape was dotted with stone fortresses of faith where the daughters of the high nobility were sequestered from a world of brutal politics. These convents were not merely spiritual retreats but strategic repositories for women whose marriages were not yet profitable or whose presence at court was a threat to inheritance. Behind these towering walls, the soft rustle of silk was replaced by the scratch of wool, and the vibrant music of the court was exchanged for the monotonous rhythm of the Gregorian chant. Yet, the very exclusivity of these spaces made them the most coveted prizes for men who viewed the forbidden as a personal challenge. For a young woman born into a house of dukes or counts, the convent offered a paradoxical form of freedom within its strict confinement. Here, away from the prying eyes of suitors and the demands of patriarchs, a silent community flourished in a state of perpetual feminine isolation. This isolation, however, acted like a vacuum, pulling in the gaze of the outside world with an intensity that no amount of prayer could dampen. The more the church fathers emphasized the sanctity of the cloister, the more it became a mythical landscape in the minds of those who lived outside its heavy, iron-studded oak doors. The architectural design of these abbeys was intended to reflect the celestial order, with high windows that admitted light but prevented a view of the street. Every gate was a barrier between the temporal and the eternal, guarded by aging porters who were supposed to be immune to the temptations of the flesh. These stone barriers were meant to be absolute, creating a sanctuary where the purity of the soul could be maintained without distraction. However, the rigidity of these structures only served to inspire more creative forms of bypass, as the human heart proved far more adaptable than the mortar and stone of the cathedrals. Inside the scriptoriums, the learned men of the church produced endless volumes detailing the virtues of virginity and the spiritual dangers of the feminine form. They wrote treatises in the year 1310 that compared the convent to a garden enclosed, a private paradise reserved for the divine bridegroom alone. These texts were read with solemnity in the refectories, even as the world outside began to view these gardens as treasures waiting to be plundered. The theological obsession with purity paradoxically highlighted the vulnerability of the very institutions it sought to protect from the secular world. While the official doctrine preached a life of asceticism and denial, a vibrant and often scandalous shadow life began to take root beneath the surface of the monastic order. The daughters of the elite did not always leave their worldly desires at the gate, and the wealth they brought with them often ensured that their penance was a comfortable one. Spices, fine wines, and letters from the outside world found their way through the cracks in the walls, carried by servants and corrupt officials. This hidden network of communication became the bridge across which the first whispers of the great masquerade would eventually travel. Among the most frequent architects of these intrusions were the younger sons of noble families, men who had the breeding and the education to understand the internal workings of the church. These gallants, often denied their own inheritance by the law of primogeniture, found a thrill in subverting the very rules that governed their sisters' lives. To them, the convent was not a holy site but a labyrinth of desire, where the thrill of the hunt was heightened by the threat of excommunication or physical punishment. They looked at the heavy black habits of the nuns and saw not a symbol of mourning, but a perfect disguise. The wandering students of the era, known as the Goliards, also played a crucial role in the desecration of these sacred spaces. These intellectual vagabonds traveled from university to university, carrying with them a culture of ribald poetry and a deep-seated cynicism toward ecclesiastical authority. Their knowledge of Latin and their familiarity with the liturgy allowed them to move through the religious world with an ease that a common peasant could never hope to achieve. For a student fleeing debt or a failed examination, the sanctuary of a convent offered a uniquely dangerous and exciting alternative to the harsh life on the open road. The realization that the feminine habit was the ultimate key to these locked doors did not happen overnight, but through a series of desperate and calculated experiments. A man dressed as a knight or a merchant stood no chance of passing the porter's lodge, but a silent, bowed figure in a novice's robe was rarely questioned. The habit functioned as a social invisibility cloak, stripping the individual of their gender and replacing it with a generic, holy identity. Once the veil was donned, the men ceased to exist in the eyes of the gatekeeper, replaced by a shadow that the church itself had taught everyone to respect. In the year 1340, the trade in stolen religious garments became a lucrative underground market in cities like Paris and Cologne. A merchant of illicit goods could provide a seeker with everything from the starched wimple of a Benedictine to the grey wool of a Cistercian novice. These garments were often stripped from the dead or sold by desperate monks, and they carried with them the weight of authenticity. For the right price, a man could purchase the identity of a woman of God, ensuring that his physical appearance would match the expectations of even the most observant Mother Superior. The process of transformation was a meticulous labor of ego-suppression and physical alteration that required hours of preparation in the dark. A man would have to learn the specific ways in which a nun moved her hands, the way she tucked them into her sleeves, and the way her head tilted under the weight of the veil. He had to master the art of the downcast gaze, an expression that signaled humility but also served to hide the more masculine lines of the brow and jaw. In the flickering light of a single candle, the transition from hunter to prey was completed, as the predator donned the skin of the lamb. The psychological toll of this deception was immense, as the intruder had to maintain his persona through every waking hour of the monastic day. He would rise at the sound of the bell for matins, standing in the cold chapel among dozens of women, his heart racing with the fear of a single slip of the tongue. The constant proximity to the very women he sought to observe or seduce was both an intoxication and a torment. Every shared prayer was a moment of supreme irony, as he petitioned a God he was actively mocking with his presence, all while maintaining the serene expression of a devout and humble virgin. Often, these men were not acting alone but were part of a larger conspiracy involving sympathetic servants or even the nuns themselves. In an age where many women were forced into the convent against their will, the presence of a sister who was in reality a lover or a friend was a secret they were more than willing to keep. These alliances formed a silent pact of protection, where the survival of the intruder depended on the silence of the community. In such cases, the convent became a fortress not against the world, but against the hierarchy of the church itself, protecting a secret rebellion. The danger of discovery was ever present, lurking in the most mundane moments of communal life, such as the shared meals in the refectory or the manual labor in the gardens. A sudden laugh that was too deep, a heavy footfall on the stone stairs, or a moment of physical exertion that revealed a masculine strength could all lead to catastrophe. The impostors had to be constantly mindful of their physical presence, shrinking their shoulders and softening their voices to maintain the illusion. It was a performance of the highest order, where the stakes were not just reputation but the safety of the body. As the decades passed, the frequency of these scandals began to alarm the higher echelons of the clergy, who realized that their enclosed gardens were far from secure. In the year 1362, reports reached the ears of the Archbishop of Sens concerning a convent where the population of sisters seemed to fluctuate in a manner that defied logic. Upon inspection, it was found that the porous nature of the monastery's perimeter allowed for a constant stream of men to enter and exit under the cover of the habit. The veil had become a mask for a thriving community of transgressors. The men who engaged in these charades often found that the masquerade changed them in ways they had not anticipated. Living within the rhythms of the feminine divine, some found themselves caught between their original desires and the strange peace of the monastic life. The irony was that while they had entered to find forbidden pleasure, the constant exposure to the liturgy and the quietude of the cells sometimes fostered a genuine, if twisted, sense of spirituality. This duality created a complex internal world where the lines between the actor and the role became increasingly difficult to distinguish. Influential nobles used their power to ensure that their cousins or protégés were placed in specific convents, often under the guise of providing them with a holy education. These placements were carefully orchestrated bribes, where the entry of a disguised man was facilitated by a substantial donation to the abbey's coffers. In this way, the corruption of the aristocracy and the financial desperation of the church collided, creating a system where the sanctity of the nunnery was a commodity that could be bought and sold. The sisterhood became a guild of secrets where the currency was silence. By the end of the 14th century, the image of the nun had been so thoroughly subverted in the popular imagination that the habit was no longer seen as a guarantee of virtue. Tales of the sister with the heavy boots or the nun who never spoke became staples of local folklore, serving as both warnings and entertainment. These stories reflected a growing skepticism toward the institutional church and its ability to police its own boundaries. The fortress of faith had become a house of mirrors, where the identity of the person beneath the veil was a matter of doubt and the space was under siege. The ultimate irony lay in the fact that the very walls built to keep the world out had succeeded only in locking the corruption in. By creating a space that was theoretically untouchable, the church had created a perfect environment for a unique form of criminality to flourish. The men in the habits were not just breaking the law of men, they were rewriting the laws of social interaction, proving that even the most rigid structures could be subverted by a simple change of clothes. The convent, once a symbol of the celestial city, had become the primary laboratory for the most scandalous experiments. As the sun set over these sprawling estates of stone and prayer, the shadows of the cloister lengthened, hiding the true nature of those who walked within. Each gate that was bolted shut for the night served only to protect the secrets that were already inside, ensuring that the masquerade could continue until the morning bell. The church continued to write its treatises and issue its decrees, but the reality on the ground was a messy, human tangle of desire and deception. The keys to the kingdom were no longer held only by the priests, but were being forged in the dark by anyone bold enough. Looking back from the perspective of the 1500s, one can see that this era of infiltration was a symptom of a deeper crisis in the medieval social contract. The rigid boundaries of gender and class were being tested by a population that was increasingly mobile and disillusioned with the old certainties. The man who dressed as a nun was a pioneer of a sort, a transgressor who exposed the fragility of the sacred. His presence in the choir was a silent scream against the constraints of his time, a defiant act of rebellion that turned the most holy of garments into a weapon of subversion. In the cold, pre-dawn hours of the 14th century, a lone figure crouches in the corner of a stone cell, far from the communal light of the scriptorium. Here, the first act of a daily, agonizing transformation begins. With a blade sharpened to a lethal edge and a bowl of frigid water, the man meticulously removes every trace of hair from his jaw and neck. There is no room for error. A single missed patch or a visible nick could mean the difference between continued survival and a public execution. The scrape of steel against skin is the only sound in the suffocating darkness of the tiny chamber, marking the start of a day lived entirely as someone else. This ritual is performed not once, but twice every single day, as the relentless nature of biology threatens to betray the masquerade with every passing hour. The shadow of a beard is a death sentence, and so the skin is kept perpetually raw and tender from constant scraping. To soothe the irritation and further mask the coarse texture of male skin, these men employ a thick paste made of white lead and ground starch. This substance, while toxic over long periods, provides a pale, ethereal mask that mimics the anemic complexion often associated with a life of cloistered devotion and perpetual fasting, effectively turning a masculine face into a saintly icon. The art of disguise extends far beyond the surface of the skin, reaching into the very structure of the medieval religious habit. The wimple, a stiffened linen cloth that wraps around the neck and chin, serves as a masterstroke of architectural concealment. By pulling the fabric tight against the jawline, an impostor can hide the prominent Adam's apple and the squareness of a masculine chin. When combined with the heavy black veil that falls forward to frame the face, the peripheral vision of those around them is restricted, and more importantly, the face of the wearer is cast into a deep, perpetual shadow that discourages close and prolonged scrutiny from the other sisters. To move through the corridors of the abbey without drawing attention, the intruder must unlearn every instinct of his former life. A man's stride is typically long and driven by the shoulders, a movement that would immediately stand out in a community of women. Instead, these men train themselves to take short, gliding steps, keeping their knees close together and their weight centered low. They mimic the humble, flowing gait of the nuns, appearing to float across the stone floors rather than walk. Every movement is calculated to be soft and unassuming, a physical performance of submissive grace that hides the coiled strength of a soldier or a scholar beneath the wool. The voice, perhaps the most difficult trait to master, is handled with a combination of discipline and strategic silence. While some men possess a natural falsetto or can train their vocal cords to produce a soft, breathy whisper, many choose a more foolproof path. By taking a voluntary vow of silence, an impostor can bypass the risk of a voice cracking or slipping into a deeper register. In the medieval church, such a vow was seen as a mark of extreme piety and devotion, granting the individual a shield of sacred isolation. This silence is not just a spiritual choice, it is a tactical necessity that prevents any verbal slip that might reveal the truth. During the long hours of the liturgy, when the sisters gather to sing the divine office, the man in the habit must be a master of mimicry. He does not lead the chants but follows the collective voice of the choir, blending his tones into the soprano and alto registers of the group. He learns to use the resonant spaces of the cathedral to his advantage, allowing the echoes to mask the specific qualities of his own voice. By standing in the middle of the pack and keeping his head bowed low over his psalter, he becomes a nameless, faceless part of a holy machine, his true identity swallowed by the overwhelming wall of sound that rises toward the vaulted ceiling. The wide, billowing sleeves of the monastic habit are another crucial tool in this ongoing deception, providing ample space to hide the musculature of the arms. When a nun crosses her arms and tucks her hands into these sleeves, she presents an image of quiet contemplation. For the men, this posture hides the calloused palms and thick wrists that might give him away. He learns to keep his hands folded and hidden at all times, only revealing them during necessary tasks and even then, moving with a delicate precision that belies his true strength. The fabric acts as a soft barrier between his physical reality and the world's perception. Sharing a meal in the refectory is a test of nerves that occurs several times a day under the watchful eyes of the Mother Superior. The impostor must eat with a feigned lack of appetite, picking at the bread and pottage as if food were a mere afterthought to his spiritual hunger. He must avoid the vigorous chewing and large bites that characterize masculine eating habits, adopting instead a slow, dainty method of consumption. The clatter of wooden spoons and the reading of scripture provide a distraction, but the fear of a sudden, loud sound causing a masculine reaction remains a constant, pulsing thread in the back of his mind. The communal nature of the dormitory poses the greatest challenge to the secret life of the disguised men. In most abbeys, sisters sleep in large, open halls or in small cells that are never truly private. To maintain the illusion, the man never fully undresses, sleeping in his undergarments and keeping his habit within arm's reach at all times. He becomes a light sleeper, sensitive to the slightest movement or the sound of an approaching footstep. The darkness of the night is his ally, but it is also a time of extreme vulnerability where a single groan in his sleep or an unconscious movement could strip away the mask he has worked so hard to build. Hygiene in the medieval convent is a rare and communal affair, often involving the shared use of laundry facilities and limited bathing. To avoid discovery, the men must develop elaborate excuses to wash in private or at unusual hours. He might claim a recurring skin condition or a specific penance that requires him to perform his ablutions alone. These excuses are often accepted without question because of the culture of modesty that permeates the cloister. The very rules designed to protect the modesty of the nuns are the same rules that allow the impostor to hide his true form from the eyes of his unsuspecting companions for years on end. As the years pass, the man begins to inhabit the role of the sister so thoroughly that the mask becomes difficult to remove. He learns the subtle social hierarchies of the convent, the whispered alliances between the sisters, and the hidden tensions that define their daily lives. He becomes a confidant, a pillar of the community, and sometimes even a mentor to the younger novices. There is a profound irony in his position. He is a predator who has become a protector, a lie that has become a fundamental truth to those around him. The emotional burden of this double life is immense, creating a fractured psyche that exists in a state of perpetual tension. In the year 1412, a scandal erupted in a southern French diocese when a sister who had lived in an abbey for 15 years was discovered to be a man only after a fall rendered him unconscious. Up until that moment, he had been considered one of the most devout members of the order, even rising to the position of cellarer. The shock of the community was not just at the presence of a man, but at the realization that they had loved and trusted a ghost. This case highlighted the terrifying effectiveness of a well-executed disguise and the ease with which the human eye can be trained to see only what it expects to find. The use of scent also plays a subtle role in the maintenance of the deception, as the man must mask the natural pheromones and odors associated with the male body. He might carry sachets of dried lavender, rose petals, or mint within the folds of his habit, claiming they are for medicinal purposes or to ward off the dampness of the stone walls. This floral veil provides a sensory layer to the disguise, reinforcing the feminine identity through the nose as much as through the eyes and ears. Every detail, no matter how small, is a brick in the wall that separates the intruder from the harsh reality of exposure and ruin. Despite the constant danger, many of these men find a strange sense of peace within the walls of the convent. The structured life of prayer and the absence of the violent expectations placed upon men in the outside world offer a unique sanctuary. They find that the performance of femininity allows them to explore aspects of their character, nurturing, quiet, and contemplative, that would be denied to them as knights or laborers. This psychological shift makes the disguise even more convincing, as the man is no longer just acting, he is, in many ways, becoming the sister he portrays, even as his secret remains a dormant volcano. The fear of sickness is a constant shadow over the life of the impostor, as a fever or a fainting spell could lead to a physical examination by a physician or a fellow sister. In an age where medical care was intimate and invasive, a single day of weakness could undo decades of careful planning. These men often become self-taught herbalists, treating their own ailments with stolen tinctures and roots to avoid the need for outside help. They live in a state of hypervigilance, knowing that their health is the thin thread upon which their entire existence hangs, making every cough or ache a potential harbinger of doom. The success of these deceptions relies heavily on the culture of the convent itself, which prizes conformity and discourages individual curiosity. If a sister acts strangely, it is often attributed to a spiritual crisis or a personal penance rather than a fundamental flaw in her identity. The Mother Superior, often a noblewoman herself with her own secrets to keep, may ignore minor irregularities for the sake of maintaining the peace and reputation of the house. In this environment of collective denial and enforced modesty, the man in the habit can thrive, protected by the very institution he is actively subverting with every breath he takes. Even the way a man holds a pen or a needle is a potential giveaway, as the fine motor skills of a medieval woman were often trained differently from those of a man. The impostor must practice the delicate art of illumination or embroidery in secret, softening his touch until it matches the intricate work of the sisters. He watches their hands as they work, mimicking the rhythm of their stitches and the pressure of their quills. To be found lacking in these traditionally feminine skills would not necessarily expose him as a man, but it would mark him as an outsider, an anomaly that might invite unwanted attention and further questions. As the sun sets on the abbey, the man joins the line of sisters for vespers, his face hidden, his voice a whisper, and his secrets locked tight within his chest. He has survived another day in the most dangerous game of his life, a game where the prize is a sanctuary built on a foundation of lies. The bells toll across the valley, a sound of comfort to the faithful, but a countdown for the man who knows that tomorrow morning, the ritual of the razor must begin all over again. The masquerade continues, a silent rebellion against the rigid walls of history, hidden in the heart of the sacred. The relentless march of biological reality often proved to be the most formidable enemy of the grand monastic masquerade, turning a solemn life of prayer into a theater of the absurd. Despite the most meticulous grooming and the thickest layers of lead-based powders, the natural tendencies of the male body remained a dormant volcano, waiting for the slightest lapse in vigilance to erupt. In the year 1388, this tension between the sacred mask and the profane reality reached a breaking point that would be etched into the ecclesiastical chronicles for centuries to come as a moment of both profound shame and dark comedy. The rumors began as mere whispers in the markets of Lincoln, traveling from the mouths of weary travelers to the ears of the local clergy. People spoke of a certain abbey where the sisters possessed a physical vitality that seemed to defy the expectations of their ascetic lifestyle. It was said that these nuns moved with a heavy, rhythmic thud that shook the floorboards of the local taverns when they passed by, and their shadows against the stone walls appeared broad and imposing, more akin to knights than to the humble handmaidens of the Lord. These tales of unusually robust sisters soon became impossible to ignore. In the autumn of 1388, the Bishop of Lincoln, a man known for his stern adherence to the letter of the law and his deep suspicion of any irregularity, decided to investigate these claims personally. He arrived at the gates of the abbey with a retinue of clerks and armed guards, his face a mask of grim determination. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves, a somber backdrop for the unfolding drama. He was not there to offer blessings or to collect tithes, but to peel back the layers of tradition and find the truth hidden beneath the black wool of the habits. As the bishop entered the refectory, the sisters gathered in a line, their heads bowed and their hands tucked deeply into their voluminous sleeves. The silence was absolute, yet the bishop's keen eyes moved slowly over the assembled group, noting the subtle inconsistencies that the nuns had hoped to hide. He observed that several of the sisters stood significantly taller than their companions, their shoulders stretching the seams of their garments in a way that suggested a framework of bone and muscle far sturdier than that of any high-born lady. The tension in the room was palpable, a cold dread that settled in the bones. The bishop began his inspection by walking slowly down the line, stopping occasionally to peer closely at a face or to listen to the rhythm of a sister's breath. He noticed that while many of the nuns possessed the pale, smooth skin of the cloister, others showed a peculiar coarseness around the jawline. Under the flickering light of the torches, the thick white powder used to mask the skin appeared cracked and uneven, revealing the unmistakable blue-gray tint of a 5 o'clock shadow that no razor could fully conquer. It was a visual betrayal of the highest order, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of holiness. With a sharp command that echoed through the vaulted hall, the bishop ordered the sisters to remove their wimples and veils. This was a request of unprecedented severity, a violation of the modesty that the Church itself had mandated for centuries. A collective gasp rose from the group, and several sisters visibly trembled, their faces turning a ghostly shade of white. The bishop remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on those who hesitated the most. He knew that the veil was the primary barrier between the world and the secret, and he was determined to tear that barrier down, regardless of the scandal it might provoke. As the first veils were pulled away, the extent of the deception became shockingly clear. Beneath the starched linen of the headpieces, instead of the expected long tresses or the modest, short-cropped hair of a nun, several sisters revealed heads of hair that were cut in the distinct, masculine styles of the secular world. Some even bore the faint marks of the tonsure, the circular shaving of the head used by monks, suggesting that these impostors had merely swapped one religious habit for another to gain access to the forbidden feminine realm. The sight was so jarring that one of the bishop's own clerks dropped his quill in astonishment. The bishop's fury grew as he moved to the next row, where he found a sister whose features were so aggressively masculine that it seemed a miracle she had ever been accepted into the order. Her brow was heavy, her nose broken as if from a tavern brawl, and her neck bore the thick cords of a laborer. When she attempted to protest in a high-pitched, forced voice, the sound cracked and deepened into a resonant baritone, filling the hall with a sound that was undeniably male. The absurdity of the situation threatened to boil over into chaos, as the holy space was suddenly populated by men in dresses. While the bishop conducted his grim census within the stone walls, another form of exposure was taking place in the fields surrounding the abbey. It was the height of the harvest season, a time of grueling physical labor when every able hand was needed to gather the grain before the winter rains. The nuns worked alongside the lay brothers, their habits pinned up to allow for easier movement as they swung their heavy scythes. In the heat of the afternoon sun, the formalities of the cloister were often forgotten in favor of efficiency, and it was here that the most visceral and undeniable proof of the masquerade was revealed. The wind swept across the golden fields of Lincoln, catching the heavy fabric of a sister's habit as she leaned forward to bundle a sheaf of wheat. In a sudden, violent gust, the garment was lifted higher than she had intended, exposing the lower half of her body to the gathered crowd of villagers and workers. To their collective horror and morbid fascination, the legs revealed were not the pale, slender limbs of a woman, but were covered in a thick, dark forest of masculine hair. The sight of these sturdy, hirsute legs beneath the holy garments of a nun was a visual dissonance that many in the crowd could not immediately process. The reaction among the gathered faithful was a mixture of religious terror and hysterical confusion. Several of the local women, overcome by the sight of such a profound desecration, fell into fits of mass fainting, their bodies dropping into the cut stalks of grain like fallen timber. The men shouted in anger, some reaching for stones while others simply stared in a state of paralysis. The image of the hairy sister became an instant icon of the era's corruption, a grotesque parody of the purity that the abbey was supposed to represent. The sanctity of the harvest was shattered by the intrusion of the carnal and the deceptive. Back inside the abbey, the bishop's investigation had turned into a full-scale interrogation. He demanded to know how such a large number of men had successfully bypassed the gatekeepers and lived among the women without being caught. The stories that emerged were a tapestry of bribes, forged papers, and the complicity of those who were supposed to be the guardians of the faith. Some men had entered to follow lovers, others to escape the law, and some simply for the thrill of the forbidden. The comedy of their physical discovery was now being replaced by the cold, hard reality of the legal and spiritual consequences they would face. One of the men, a former soldier who had spent 3 years as Sister Catherine, stood before the bishop with a defiant look in his eyes. He had become a favorite of the older nuns for his strength in the gardens and his skill at fixing the leaky roof of the chapel. When questioned, he admitted that his beard grew so rapidly that he had to shave during the midnight hour of matins, using the reflection in a polished silver tray to avoid cutting himself in the dark. His story was a testament to the sheer exhaustion of maintaining a lie that required constant physical intervention against the natural urges of the body. The bishop also discovered that the sisters had developed a complex system of signals to warn each other of approaching inspections or the arrival of curious outsiders. They used specific variations in the ringing of the bells and even subtle changes in the arrangement of the flowers on the altar to communicate the level of danger. This secret brotherhood within the sisterhood was a shadow organization that operated in the heart of the sacred, turning the abbey into a labyrinth where the truth was hidden behind 1,000 small, daily deceptions. The level of organization was as impressive as it was deeply disturbing. As the sun began to set on that fateful day in 1388, the bishop ordered the immediate arrest of the impostors. They were stripped of their stolen habits and forced to stand in their tunics, their masculine forms now undeniable in the cooling air of the courtyard. The transformation back into men was as sudden as it was jarring, leaving the remaining nuns in a state of profound shock and spiritual vertigo. They looked at the men who had been their companions and saw only strangers, their memories of the past few years now tainted by the knowledge of the grand and prolonged deception. The legal proceedings that followed were among the most sensational of the century, filling the court records with descriptions of bearded virgins and warrior nuns. The accounts of the hairy legs in the field became a favorite topic of the minstrels, who turned the tragedy into a series of bawdy ballads that were sung in every tavern from London to York. The church attempted to suppress these stories, but the image of the hairy leg beneath the veil had already taken root in the public imagination, serving as a permanent reminder of the fallibility of the holy institutions and the persistence of the human flesh. The emotional fallout for the community of genuine nuns was devastating. Many felt that their own vows had been mocked and that their sacred space had been permanently polluted by the presence of the intruders. The bishop ordered a series of purification rituals to be performed, but the memory of the coarse faces and the deep, hidden voices remained in the air like a foul odor. The laughter of the villagers outside the walls served as a constant reminder of the ridicule they had been brought to, as the abbey transformed from a house of God into a punchline for a joke that would never truly end. The case of the Bishop of Lincoln highlighted a fundamental flaw in the medieval monastic system, the absolute reliance on appearances as a guarantee of reality. By focusing so heavily on the external signs of piety, the habit, the veil, the silence, the church had created a loophole that the clever and the desperate were more than happy to exploit. The masquerade was not just an act of individual deception, but a systemic failure that allowed the boundaries between the sexes to be blurred by nothing more than a few yards of fabric and a steady hand with a razor. The truth was out, and it was far more complicated than a simple prayer. Ultimately, the disaster of 1388 served as a catalyst for a series of even more restrictive laws governing the lives of religious women. The fear of another, hairy sister, led to increasingly invasive inspections and a near-total isolation from the outside world. Yet, even these measures could not completely erase the memory of the day when nature finally took its revenge on the church's attempts to control it. The comedy of the discovery was a sharp, painful reminder that under the most sacred of garments, there beat a human heart that was as prone to deception and desire as any in the secular world. The image of those hairy legs, revealed by a sudden gust of wind, remains the enduring symbol of this era of monastic scandal. It represents the moment when the carefully constructed illusion of the medieval world collided with the messy, undeniable facts of biology. For the people of Lincoln, and for the readers of the chronicles in the centuries that followed, the story was a cautionary tale about the dangers of the hidden and the power of the truth to emerge in the most inconvenient and absurd of ways. The masquerade was over, but the echoes of the laughter and the feints would linger in the stones of the abbey forever. The echoes of the great scandal in Lincoln had barely subsided when the heavy hand of the Vatican reached across the continent to reclaim its lost authority over the sacred feminine space. In the year 1298, Pope Boniface VIII stood before his council and issued the bull known as Periculoso, a document of staggering legal weight that sought to turn every convent into a tomb for the living. He declared that the only way to protect the virtue of religious women was to seal them away forever, decreeing that once a woman took her vows, she was never to leave the monastery walls again. This was a direct response to the infiltration of men, a desperate attempt to patch the holes in the church's spiritual armor. The immediate result of this papal decree was a flurry of construction across the landscape of medieval Europe, as masons and carpenters were hired to raise the heights of perimeter walls and install heavy iron bars on every window. Doors that had once been open to the local community were replaced by thick, oak portals with complex locking mechanisms that could only be operated from the outside. The windows of the cells were narrowed to mere slits, allowing the light of the divine to enter but preventing any communication with the secular world. The convents were transformed into stone fortresses of enforced chastity, intended to be impenetrable to any masculine presence from the outside. For the women trapped within these newly fortified walls, the psychological weight of the enclosure was suffocating, creating a sense of being buried alive in the service of an ideal that felt increasingly distant. The silence of the cloister was no longer a chosen path of devotion but a mandated isolation that stripped them of their connection to their families and their past lives. This environment of absolute seclusion, however, created a dangerous vacuum where the normal rules of society ceased to apply. By cutting the convents off from public scrutiny, the Church unknowingly created the perfect conditions for a deeper, more sophisticated form of corruption to take root and flourish in the dark. Instead of ending the masquerade, the new laws of enclosure simply shifted the economics of the deception, turning the entry of an impostor into a high-stakes luxury for the incredibly wealthy. As the difficulty of gaining access increased, so did the price of entry for those men who were determined to breach the sanctuary. Families of powerful young men, seeking to hide them from political rivals or to facilitate a forbidden romance, began to look at the convent as a secure vault that could be opened with enough gold. The sacred veil was no longer just a religious garment but a premium commodity that could be purchased by those with the right connections. The figures standing at the center of this burgeoning trade were the mother superiors, many of whom were noblewomen themselves with a keen understanding of political leverage and financial survival. Faced with the daunting task of maintaining large stone estates and feeding dozens of sisters without the traditional income from public charity, these abbesses became pragmatic managers of a secret economy. They learned to balance the spiritual needs of their flock with the material demands of the institution, often concluding that a significant donation from a powerful family was worth the risk of admitting a novice whose physical appearance was somewhat irregular. The transaction often began with a discreet meeting in the abbey's outer parlor, where a heavy purse of gold would be exchanged for a promise of total discretion. The abbess would listen to a story about a distant cousin, a girl of quiet temperament and fragile health who required the absolute seclusion of the monastery for her own safety. Both parties understood the subtext of the conversation, but the formalities were maintained to provide a thin layer of deniability. In the year 1305, records suggest that some of the most prestigious convents in France were accepting novices whose entry fees could pay for the construction of entire new chapels. When the new sister finally arrived, she was often brought to the gate under the cover of night or in a carriage with heavy curtains to avoid any unwanted attention from the townspeople. The abbess would greet the newcomer personally, bypassing the standard intake procedures and assigning the individual to a private cell or a remote corner of the dormitory. The other sisters were told to respect the newcomer's vow of silence or her need for medical seclusion, instructions that were rarely questioned in an environment where obedience to the mother superior was absolute. Thus, the masculine presence was established within the fortress. To the casual observer within the community, these new arrivals were often seen as oddities, characterized by their unusually broad frames and the way they moved with a certain heaviness that the light habits of the sisters could not entirely mask. However, the culture of the convent was built on the avoidance of eye contact and the suppression of individual curiosity, making it easy to ignore the suspicious breadth of a novice's shoulders or the coarseness of her skin. The gold that had paved her way into the sanctuary also ensured that any whispers of doubt were quickly silenced by the leadership, who had far too much to lose if the truth ever came to light. By the year 1320, the internal life of many abbeys had begun to diverge sharply from the image of austere devotion projected to the outside world. Once the doors were locked for the night and the last prayers of Compline had been chanted, the masks of the day were often cast aside in favor of a more decadent reality. In the deep cellars and the private quarters of the abbess, the rigid habits were exchanged for forbidden silks and furs, and the simple pottage of the refectory was replaced by roasted meats and fine wines imported from the southern vineyards. The sanctuary was becoming a venue for the very world it was meant to exclude. The sounds of the night in these institutions changed from the rhythmic breathing of sleeping sisters to the muffled sounds of laughter, clinking goblets, and music that had no place in a house of God. These secret gatherings were not just about physical pleasure but represented a profound rebellion against the stifling constraints of the enclosure. The men who had bought their way in became the center of a hidden social circle, their presence a constant reminder of the fragility of the church's authority. Under the cover of darkness, the convent functioned as a high society salon where the elite could indulge in the forbidden without fear of discovery. The complicity of the rank-and-file nuns was often secured through a combination of fear and the promise of a better life within the walls. Sisters who might have otherwise reported the presence of a man were often bought off with extra rations, better clothing, or the promise of protection from the more arduous tasks of the monastery. A shadow hierarchy developed, where those who were, in the secret, enjoyed privileges that their more devout companions could only dream of. The community was split between those who still believed in the sanctity of their mission and those who had accepted the new, corrupt reality of their home. The higher echelons of the church were not entirely ignorant of these developments, but they often chose to maintain a tactical silence to protect the overarching reputation of the institution. A public scandal of this magnitude would not only damage the local diocese but could undermine the spiritual authority of the entire papacy at a time when its power was already being challenged by secular monarchs. It was better, the bishops reasoned, to deal with irregularities quietly and internally rather than risk a full-scale investigation that might reveal the extent to which the most sacred spaces had been compromised by the influence of wealth. The year 1345 saw a particularly flagrant example of this corruption in an abbey near the city of Avignon, which had become the center of the papal court. The convent, which was supposed to be a model of Cistercian reform, was in fact operating as a private resort for the sons of the local aristocracy. When a traveling friar attempted to raise the alarm, he was quickly silenced by a letter from the archbishop's office, reminding him that the internal affairs of the monastery were protected by the very bull that Boniface VIII had intended to use as a shield for purity. The law of enclosure had become the ultimate protector of vice. The physical state of the monasteries also began to reflect this internal decay, as the focus shifted from the maintenance of the chapel to the improvement of the private living quarters. While the outer walls remained imposing and forbidding, the interiors were increasingly decorated with secular luxuries that defied the vow of poverty. The spiritual health of the community was sacrificed on the altar of material comfort, and the daily rhythm of the divine office became a perfunctory chore to be completed as quickly as possible so that the real life of the house could resume behind the closed doors of the private cells. The villagers living in the shadow of these great stone walls often sensed that something was amiss, noticing the late-night arrivals of heavily laden carts and the strange, unholy sounds that drifted on the wind during the quiet hours of the night. They told stories of the Sisters of Gold and the ghosts in the garden, recognizing that the institution which claimed to pray for their souls was in fact living a life of indulgence that they could never hope to achieve. The moral authority of the church was slowly being eroded, not by an external enemy, but by the rot that was being carefully cultivated within its most secure and protected sanctuaries. Even the most devout sisters found themselves caught in a spiritual crisis as they realized that their home had become a house of mirrors where nothing was as it seemed. The presence of the impostors was a constant source of tension, a psychological weight that distorted their understanding of the divine and the human. They lived in a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance, trying to maintain their own purity while surrounded by the evidence of a profound and systemic deception. The very air of the cloister felt heavy with the unspoken truth, making every shared prayer feel like an act of hypocrisy that echoed through the empty vaults. The irony of the situation was absolute. The very measures taken to ensure the absolute separation of the sexes had only served to make the breach more permanent and more profitable. By creating a space that was legally and physically untouchable, the church had provided the perfect environment for a unique form of criminality that could not be policed from the outside. The man in the habit was no longer just an intruder, he was a tenant who had paid for his stay, protected by the very rules that were supposed to keep him out. The masquerade had moved from a desperate individual act to an institutionalized system of corruption. As the 14th century drew to a close, the convents of Europe stood as monuments to a grand and failing experiment in social control. The high walls and iron bars were no longer symbols of protection but barriers that hid the evidence of a deep spiritual malaise from the eyes of a world that was beginning to ask difficult questions. The church continued to issue its decrees and emphasize the importance of enclosure, but the reality on the ground was a messy tangle of gold and secrets. The stage was set for a final reckoning, as the shadows within the cloister grew too large and too dark to be contained any longer. The final image of this era is that of a great oak door, bolted and barred from the outside, while from within comes the faint sound of a ribald song sung in a voice that is far too deep to belong to a daughter of the church. The light from a single window flickers with the glow of a feast, casting the shadow of a broad-shouldered sister against the stone. This was the world that the papacy had built, a world where the veil was a mask and the sanctuary was a hideout, and where the only thing more valuable than salvation was the price of a secret that was known to all but spoken by none. As the 15th century dawned, the shadows within the stone walls of the European convents grew longer and more sinister than ever before. The sporadic scandals of previous decades, once dismissed as isolated acts of desperation or singular instances of folly, began to coalesce into a much more terrifying reality. Investigators sent by the high councils of the church started to uncover a pattern that defied simple explanation, suggesting that the infiltration was not a series of accidents but a systemic invasion. The holy silence of the cloisters was being used as a shroud to hide a structural rot that threatened the very foundation of the ecclesiastical world. The most chilling revelation of this era was the discovery that these men were not merely occasional guests or reckless seekers of forbidden adventure. As the high inquisitors began their rigorous audits of the monastery ledgers, they found that in several major abbeys, men had been living as sisters for decades without interruption. These individuals were not hiding in the corners or living in constant fear of discovery. Instead, they had integrated themselves into the very fabric of the monastic power structure. They had moved beyond mere disguise, becoming essential components of the institution's daily operation and its long-term survival. By the year 1420, it became clear that many of these impostors had risen to occupy the most critical administrative positions within the convents. They were the bursars who controlled the flow of gold, the cellars who managed the vast stores of grain and wine, and the scribes who maintained the official correspondence with the outside world. From these positions of influence, they were able to manipulate the internal affairs of the abbey, ensuring that their own secrets remained protected while they dictated the lives of the genuine sisters who lived under their authority. The scale of this administrative takeover was breathtaking, as these men essentially managed the economic estates of the church under the guise of holy women. They negotiated land leases with local lords, collected tithes from the peasantry, and oversaw the intricate financial investments that kept the convents wealthy. Their masculine education in law and rhetoric, often gained in the secular universities before they took the veil, gave them a distinct advantage over the women they purported to be. They turned the feminine sanctuary into a corporate machine, where the spiritual mission was a mere front for the accumulation of secular power. Perhaps the most shocking discovery made during the inspections of the year 1445 was the existence of entire dynasties of false sisters. In several prominent houses, the position of a high official was not passed from one devout woman to another, but from one disguised man to his handpicked successor. An older sister who had successfully navigated the masquerade for 20 years would take a young, broad-shouldered novice under her wing, teaching him the nuances of the feminine gait and the secrets of the ledgers. This ensured that the male control over the abbey would continue indefinitely. This generational deception turned the convent into a hereditary fiefdom, where the sacred habit was passed like a crown from one male infiltrator to the next. The genuine nuns, many of whom were elderly or had been socialized into absolute obedience, either did not notice the transition or were too intimidated to speak out. These dynasties functioned like a secret guild within the church, operating with a level of sophistication that made the previous individual scandals look amateurish. They were the architects of a hidden society that existed parallel to the official one, feeding off the resources of the faithful for their own ends. When the cracks in these facades finally became too large to ignore, the church was forced to confront a crisis that threatened to destroy its public image. If the world learned that the most sacred feminine spaces were actually being run by men, the entire moral authority of the papacy would collapse. In response, a massive and coordinated campaign of disinformation was launched in the year 1472. Instead of admitting to a massive failure of oversight and a systemic culture of corruption, the ecclesiastical authorities began to weave a much more fantastical and terrifying narrative for the public. The official church trials shifted their focus from human deception to supernatural intervention, claiming that these men were not mere mortals but demons in human form. The records began to fill with descriptions of incubi and succubi who had assumed the likeness of holy sisters to tempt the innocent and pollute the sacred. By branding the impostors as agents of Satan or victims of powerful witchcraft, the church was able to distance itself from the reality of the situation. This allowed them to execute the offenders as monsters rather than admit that their own administrative system was fundamentally broken and easily subverted. The narrative of witchcraft served as a convenient smokescreen, drawing the public's attention toward the fear of the occult and away from the uncomfortable truth of institutional rot. While the masses focused on the terrifying tales of demonic possession and unholy pacts, the real nature of the convents was being carefully obscured. The trials were used to reinforce the Church's power to define reality, turning a story of simple human greed and lust into a cosmic battle between good and evil. The truth was buried beneath a mountain of theological jargon and horrific accusations of sorcery that served to silence any skeptics. However, beneath the supernatural theater, the reality was far more mundane and far more cynical. The holy abbeys had become voluntary brothels for the secular and religious elite. The men who bought their way in and the administrators who facilitated their stay were providing a service to the powerful lords of the era. These convents offered a level of privacy and safety that no secular house could match, allowing the aristocracy to indulge in their darkest vices far from the prying eyes of their rivals. The sacred space was essentially rented out to the highest bidder, turning the house of prayer into a sanctuary for the decadent. The high walls and the papal bulls of enclosure, which were supposedly designed to protect the purity of the sisters, now served as the ultimate protection for this underground economy of vice. Within these stone fortresses, the elite could discard the restrictions of their social class and the rules of the Church, knowing that their activities were shielded by the very institutions they were desecrating. The masquerade was no longer a personal choice but a structural requirement for a system that thrived on the intersection of wealth, power, and the total control of women's bodies and lives. The final and most devastating realization is the impact this long-term deception had on the thousands of genuine women who lived within these walls. These were women who had often been forced into the convent by their families and who took their spiritual obligations with the utmost seriousness. They spent their lives in grueling cycles of labor, prayer, and silence, believing that their sacrifices were for the glory of God. To discover that their leaders and companions were actually men was a betrayal of their very existence, a violation that reached into the most private corners of their souls. These women did not just live in proximity to these men, they were systematically exploited by them, often being forced to serve the physical and emotional whims of their sisters under the threat of spiritual and physical punishment. The men used the threat of eternal damnation as a tool to maintain order, telling the women that any rebellion or word of the truth would result in the loss of their souls. The faith that was supposed to be a source of comfort and salvation was turned into a weapon of psychological terror, used to keep the victims compliant in a system that was designed to consume them. The psychological grooming was absolute, as the false administrators used their knowledge of the liturgy and the confessional to control every aspect of the sisters' thoughts and actions. They created an environment of total dependency, where the women were taught to fear the outside world and to trust only those who were secretly their oppressors. This was a form of mass incarceration of the spirit, where the jailers were dressed in the same holy garments as the prisoners. The sanctity of the feminine space was not just breached, it was completely inverted, becoming a site of prolonged and institutionalized abuse. As we look back at the 1,500 years of monastic history, the image of the pious nun in the cloister is forever haunted by the shadow of the men in her habit. This was not just a historical curiosity or a series of funny anecdotes about bearded sisters, it was the most cynical and prolonged deception in the history of human belief. The Church used the veil to hide the face of the patriarchy at its most predatory, ensuring that even in their most sacred refuge, women were never truly free from the control of men who sought to own their space and their spirits. The sheer volume of lives wasted in this grand masquerade is a tragedy that history has only recently begun to fully articulate. Thousands of women lived and died in the service of a lie, their labor used to build estates for men who mocked their faith every time they donned the veil. Their names have been lost to time, while the records of the demons and the witches who lived among them are preserved as warnings of a darkness that the Church claimed to fight, but which it actually fostered and protected for the sake of its own reputation. The final blow is the realization that the Church succeeded in its deception for centuries, using the fear of the divine to bury the evidence of its human failings. The bearded nuns were not just a mistake, they were a symptom of a world where the masculine ego demanded control even over the silence of the feminine sanctuary. The faith of the innocent was the currency used to pay for the sins of the powerful, creating a legacy of betrayal that still resonates within the cold stones of the ruined abbeys. The masquerade was the ultimate expression of a power that knew no boundaries, even those it claimed to hold most holy. The emotional weight of this story leaves us not with a sense of historical distance, but with a cold, visceral anger at the scale of the abuse. It is a story of a stolen sanctuary and a weaponized belief, where the most vulnerable were sacrificed on the altar of a grand, institutional lie. The silence of the convent, once thought to be a sign of peace, is revealed to be a silence of suppression and fear. As the final notes of the medieval chant fade away, they are replaced by the realization that under the most holy of garments, the most profound of crimes was committed in the name of God. We are left with the image of a young nun, kneeling in the dark on the cold stone floor, pouring her heart out in a confession to a person she believes is a holy mother. She speaks of her deepest fears and her highest hopes, unaware that the person listening behind the screen is a man who views her devotion as a commodity and her sanctuary as his playground. This is the enduring horror of the medieval masquerade, the theft of the one thing these women had left, their spiritual autonomy. The history of the convent is not a history of peace, but a long, dark corridor of betrayal. The final irony is that the truth only emerged when the system could no longer sustain its own weight, leaving a trail of broken lives and hollowed-out institutions. The church moved on, the aristocrats found new ways to hide their vices, but the women who were trapped in that grand deception remain the silent witnesses to a crime that has no equal. Their story is a reminder that the most dangerous masks are those worn in the service of the sacred, and that the greatest lies are often told in the most holy of whispers, turning the path to heaven into a descent into hell.